Morning, everyone. Welcome to the first policy subcommittee meeting of the academic school year. We have a shortened agenda today with mainly just two substantive items, but we'll begin with review and approval of the minutes of the June 12th, 2023 joint meeting of the Policy Review Subcommittee and the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Subcommittee. Would someone like to move the minutes?
So moved.
All right, I'll go ahead and second them. Andy, your vote?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. That brings us to discussion of the registration and enrollment policy and possible vote. And specifically, we're looking at the student assignment portion of that policy. I sent out a draft a couple days ago. I received some feedback from Valerie, and I am wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I'll just share what my feedback was. It was just really to make sure that we had no confusion with how we normally understand out of district, to change that phrase and that sort of category in the policy to either out of zone or something that mirrors how we identify the zones.
Okay. And any other comments or proposed modifications?
I guess I'll jump in. I did look at the document. Good morning, everyone. For the folks who don't know me, I'm Claire Galloway Jones. I'm the new Senior Director of Educational Equity. I looked at the document. There are definitely, I see some of the suggested edits. And I guess what I'm hoping that we can just keep in mind, I'm sure this group is doing that we want to make sure that the policy is reflective of educational equity and that it's equitable also for the district to implement. And so those are just some of the things that kind of are top of mind for me. I know there's some things around language that we can definitely kind of go over, but I'm hoping that we can really think about the policy in an organic way, that this is going to be something that we'll really be able to move forward with the flexibility that we also really need.
So Claire, as it reads now, are you seeing issues on an equity front?
There are a few things that I'm concerned about, and Megan, I know you've joined, you can kind of chime in. Again, I know I've only been here 5 minutes. I think at the first read, some of the changes seemed, like, oh, that doesn't seem like that's going to have a big impact. But as we think about implementing the policy, I definitely have some concerns, and I think that Megan can give some institutional historical knowledge that she can contribute to the conversation.
Okay, Megan, do you want to go ahead and do that?
Sure. So there's some changes in the emphasis, and I can sort of explain a little bit about how the implementation of some of these changes might have long-term impacts. Because while these changes may work for today, if we were to implement them, we of course want to be thoughtful about long-term unintended consequences that could come up because of certain uses of languages. And if we implement them, and what happens in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. One thing that I want to just state is that enrollment is, it is always in flux and it is fluid. What we see today is not what we saw 5 years ago, and it's certainly not the same that we'll see in 5 years in the future. So we would hope that this assignment policy would be able to be flexible enough to bear with things as we move through different changes, as the community changes and grows and flexes and flows. So that's the overarching issue. I do see some changes where the flexibility for how the district is able to use buffer zones has been de-emphasized and disempowered to provide equitable sized classrooms to folks if we do experience certain pinch points.
So just on that point, if I may jump in for a moment, at least the intention I had was to actually create more flexibility. So what the part that I was trying to de-emphasize was the geographic nature of the buffer zone boundary. So I was trying to remove that so that, for example, the district would have flexibility to place a student who lives in Coolidge Corner, in the part of Coolidge Corner closer to Commonwealth Avenue, for instance, could place that student at Driscoll where there's room if the district so decides because of how enrollment numbers are looking. Whereas under the current policy language, my reading of buffer zone is that it needs to be a geographically adjacent district and that a student has an actual right to attend the neighborhood school. So in taking that language out, I thought I was adding more flexibility for the district to place students anywhere within town.
So that means that buffer zones, like, if that's the intent, then that means buffer zones don't have any meaning for families moving into district, or it de-emphasizes the district's like historical emphasis on neighborhood school. That's my response to what you just shared.
And I was curious about that as well. Oh, I'm so sorry, Helen. I didn't see your hand. I'm not using my protocols here.
That's okay. I'm not even on the committee. I'm just.
I know, I'm glad to see you, Helen. Good morning.
I'm just the historian of what we've done in the past. And I think, Megan, I'm not sure, I didn't read what you sent out. Was that the new policy?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, we have in the past, we've done all sorts of variations on a theme when we had to, whether it be, we've enlarged the buffer. We first had small buffer zones, we enlarged the buffer zones. At one time, we even talked about moving a whole class from one school to another school, but that would be with transportation. So we have to be careful about that. You can't, it's taking somebody from Commonwealth Avenue and having them go over to Driscoll is like going to the moon for some families, to be able to get there who don't have a car, need to, it's a real problem. But
I mean, I think the intent, Helen, isn't to be that broad. It's to really allow for someone who is 2 streets out of the zone to be able to go to a school, perhaps where they had
when
been
they
for
buy
several years.
houses, really get, buy them for a purpose, want to be in a certain school. I mean, all our schools are the same, but, and I think it becomes, you will wreak havoc on the real estate people, on the families, and I'm not sure it helps us. That's the other side of it.
So I do see 2 separate issues here. One issue is whether students who are already enrolled can stay at the same school where they've developed friends, where they've developed community connections, even if they move to a different zone within Brookline. And my understanding from speaking to at least some people at central office is that they actually were hoping for more rigidity there in terms of allowing a student to stay at the school where they were already attending, because there have been multiple situations this year where a family moves just over the line and suddenly they're ripped out of their school community. And we want to remove that as being a barrier to continuity for our students. And from an equity perspective, I would be very concerned about, for instance, if a student's been at a school for 6 years, has a couple years left, and all of a sudden, because they moved 2 blocks away, they can't be at the same school anymore. And it seems like there are a handful of such instances. It's not some overwhelming number. So that was one intention with the modifications here. The second one was I was actually looking to afford the district greater flexibility in initial placements. So Driscoll has room, other schools are more crowded. If we are very rigid in terms of geography about initial placements, where we're granting an automatic right for a student to attend a neighborhood school, then that actually decreases flexibility for the district in terms of placement. Of course, the idea would be to place the student at the neighborhood school if possible, and I'm confident that 99 out of 100 times that would happen. But if there were to be a situation where the local school is absolutely overcrowded and we have a new student coming in, so this is not kicking someone out who's already there. There's a student who's being placed for the first time. for that student, yes, there might be the inconvenience of going a little further to school, but they're going to be at a school that has room. And in terms of the social connections part, there haven't been any that are formed yet. It's a new student.
And I think I can see what the intention was. I think in regards to families who make a move and we have a student who's in 7th and 8th grade, we wouldn't be ripping those students out of their schools. I mean, we understand that they've been there basically for the life of their K-8 career thus far. So I think that's really important for us to have that flexibility. I think when we're talking about families who are entering 6th grade, that you have an opportunity to go to a new school and build relationships there. And Megan, you can chime in. I know we spoke a little bit about families when they're first entering the district yesterday. If you could
Claire,
elaborate
can I
that.
just ask you about the first point you made, though? 'Cause I
Sure.
think that's what really prompted us a little bit to action to look at this, which is someone in 6th, 7th grade. We've been hearing of a handful this year who were getting mandatorily moved to a different district, a different school. And so I think we're all on the same page that that doesn't make sense, but I think that the way the policy is currently written, or at least how it's being implemented, that's happening. And so I'm wondering if you or Megan can speak to that.
I'd be happy to speak to that, Val. So I would say that based on conversations with our educational support teams, both at schools and at central office, a 6th grader is very different than an 8th grader in terms of their, educational experience. And in fact, I would strongly support a provision in here for an 8th grade guarantee to remain. I think that that is appropriate and aligns really well with other policies relating to admissions and residency. 6th grade is a time in other community, we happen to have this K-8, a K-8 model, but our students are very resilient. Students can make changes. Our educators are there. They can maintain community relationships with students if they've moved across town. But there is certain circumstances where we may find that the class sizes are simply too large to allow families to remain in perpetuity. And Claire is much more of an expert in terms of the other piece of student growth and educational experiences than I am. But that is what I was, the conversations that are happening. We never move a student unless we need to. The emphasis is to say yes when we can, just to be clear. We only say no doesn't help us either, right? It makes things more difficult. It is a challenge. It requires additional support and wraparound for families, which we do provide to make sure they settle well. So the emphasis is not, we're not coming from a place of no. We're coming from a place of yes. So if we say no, it is usually with good reason. And then as far as the way that these revisions present at the moment, there is a bit of perhaps unintended consequence that I would want to point out, that if a family registers, let's say for kindergarten, okay, let's take that example because this policy applies to all students. Family registers for kindergarten in March of 2024 based on their current address, okay? They get their student assignment in April of 2024 because it's the school they really, really want. And perhaps they move in May of 2024. They haven't even attended school yet, but they've received that assignment. The way that the policy is written is that we are locked for that student to remain in that school for 9 years, even though they may not be a member of that neighborhood or community, but the family has found, the way to get the assignment that they prefer. Those families who may have means may be able to finagle this. And I will say we have seen this before. So it's not an unprecedented thing. So that does result in some potential inequities of services for families, right, who may live in a neighborhood and not have the means to transport their child to a different school and so forth. I think the way the policy has worked really well, to be honest, with some changes to language and such, but the actual implementation of the way it was I don't see there being a significant challenge because it is flexible enough for us to be able to play with things as they are and say yes to families when we can to the request.
Andy?
Thanks. I just wanted to get a sense of the scale of the issue that we're dealing with. So if we leave aside the third section of the proposed policy on the buffer zones and just look at the request for transfer or requests to be out of zone, like how many in a typical year of these requests would we get of the first type, which is what prompted all of this, I think, which is a request to stay in the school after you've moved out of that zone. And then number two, a request for some other reason to be in an out of zone school. Like, how many families a year would be requesting that?
That's a good question. So families requesting to remain fluctuates based on real estate processes in the town. To be clear, different years it's different proportions. I would say probably 15 to 20 families asking to remain, maybe, and they may be moving within, a zone that they're already in. They just, we moved 2 streets over. And then the number of families asking to move or enter schools that are outside of their zone, I would say probably like maybe 20, and that includes kindergarten requests, and basically, so the scale is small, right? This is not a large scale. This is a problem that is not a problem from my perspective.
You're calling on me, David? Okay. Megan, so you talked about an 8th grade guarantee. Is it possible to extend that if we change this to at least a middle school guarantee? I'll tell you my experience of moving to a different town in 6th grade, one town over, but very different community. It was not easy to transition at that age. Middle school is a whole kettle of fish in terms of how you're developing and changing and experiencing the world. So I would love to see a middle school guarantee, because being able to stay with that community that you've been in for 6 years, to me, makes a heck of a lot of sense while you're going through your young adolescence.
Ellen?
Yeah, I think it goes against our philosophy of K-8 schools. I think that's the bigger issue. Our philosophy is that we have children pre-K to 8 in one school who have developed such close ties that it is really difficult to move, especially in 6th grade when a lot of other things are happening with you. And when you thought you were staying in the same school. I mean, that's the other piece. I think we have to be clear to families if that is the case. If for some reason we decide to change the policy or not change the policy. And I'm not clear, because the policy, when I read it, seemed very open, and allowed us a lot of flexibility. And that was the purpose of the policy, so that you could have that flexibility. And it's important, especially when we have influxes. Right now, things are a little bit more stable, I think. It's growing, but not like it has been in the past. And I think Brookline's an unusual community where people do move within the community, more so, I think, than in other cities. Many people started out in North Brookline. We did. My oldest was at Devotion when it was Devotion. And then, when we moved here in 4th grade, there was a question of trying to keep him there. And we decided, it made sense. He had enough years to be here that it made sense to go to Runkle. But I think we have to think about what our philosophy of why we have K-8s, and then how can we make it easiest for families. Sometimes it's not an easy choice, and I understand what happened with this family, and I wish, I don't know where we ended up with it, but I do think I agree with Val that 6th grade is not a good time to change kids, unless it's, we're at 30 kids or something like that per grade, per class or something like that.
So Helen, to answer your question about that family, first of all, it's more than one family. Secondly, The families have been all permitted to have their children remain at the same school, but that was subject to the expectation of a policy change that was going to be imminent to actually remove some of this discretion in the decision making, because unfortunately, while the policy as currently written provides the discretion for the district to keep students at the same school when the families move a few blocks over, that discretion, at least in these instances, was not being used to keep the students at those schools. And so that also is what prompted the need to revisit this. I share your concern about pushing children out of K-8 schools with those connections that they form. And like, as you were alluding to, the whole reason we have the K-8 model is to try to keep kids in those communities from early childhood through early adolescence. And this notion that for what amounts to a handful of families potentially making requests to stay in schools where they've already been, that we should allow for them to be ripped out of those school communities. I'm not saying that's ever the intention, but it's happening. And I think that we strongly value continuity and maintaining those social connections. So that's why I was looking to make modifications in such a way that we wouldn't have enrollment concerns. So in terms of kids who are already at these schools, they're already counting towards those numbers. But if we adjust buffer zones or include language that allows a district to place new students outside of zones, then that shouldn't have an impact on the overall attendance. Because if a new student moves into that local zone and there isn't room for that new student and that new student's placed somewhere else, at least on the social connections part of it, that student's not missing out. I understand that if there's an extreme situation of placing someone at Baker when they live in Coolidge Corner, then there's the equity piece of not being able to participate necessarily in after-school activities and being able to walk to school, et cetera. But that would be a very extreme example. I can't imagine the district thinking it would be appropriate to place someone who lives on Com Ave at Baker. Our North Point schools are pretty close to each other.
I think you're trying to solve one problem and making another problem. So that's the way I hear this, because just as many people will start screaming about being on Commonwealth Avenue and going to Runkle School, you know?
But it's discretionary. No one's forcing the district to do it. No one's saying it's mandatory if you're at a cap that you must send the student out of zone. It's just allowing the district to.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes the family wants to. There might be.
And that's fine. And they have that, Megan, correct me if I'm wrong, they have that option. The family wants to. We always, in the past, when we've had problems with enrollment in a particular school, we've sort of offered, very enticingly to parents, you can go to this school, but your class size is going to be this. If you go to that school, your class size is going to be that for new parents. And they usually choose to make the right choice. So Megan, what do you see as the problem that we need to solve here?
So I don't see a problem with the policy as it stands, Helen. It works well. It is open. It is flexible. Families do get what they want. So I do not see any particular specific problem that needs to be solved. The district is more than happy to, learn more about the committee's values and how the implementation and interpretation of this policy, which is open, can do, to dictate that we must and allow every student to remain. What happens if we do have class sizes of 30, right? That could happen. If you allow one student to remain, two students to remain, three students to remain over the course of 9-10 years, if you're including BEEP, although their assignments are not currently based on geography. They're just, they sign up based on where they want to go. We could end up with these absolute bubbles, families who have the means to make changes and accommodate their preferences, and other families who do not have those means. Those families who are long-term Brookline residents would be preferred over those who are perhaps renters and have the opportunity to join the community. They would be disadvantaged in the opportunity to join a neighborhood school community. If this kind of goes forward, I find that concerning. And I would also say, like, if we're talking about longevity, how long a family has been part of a community, what if they joined in 5th grade in May? Does that still count? That we would be guaranteed to stay for middle school, for instance, so that we don't have the full, the kind of community that we have is so diverse in terms of the types of families we have and how they arrive and what they're spending their time doing here. Not everybody starts in kindergarten and graduates from BHS. I would say probably about half of the community does that, maybe. And the other half of the community, we would want to make sure that they're experiencing the same school experience as their peers who were lucky enough to, have perhaps been born into the community and live there their whole lives. We would want them to have the same experience and community.
And if I could just jump in. Yeah, thank you so much, David. I just want to jump in and say, I firmly believe in the K-8 model. I mean, I think we want to make sure that all of our students across the district are experiencing academic and SEL consistency so they have success. But when we think about developmentally, we know many students at middle school age go off to independent school. Sometimes they come back and return for high school. It's a natural break. All change is going to be difficult for the family and for the student, but it is typically a age where we can do a break. I'm concerned, Helen, I really appreciate the historical knowledge. I guess I'm very much concerned about bubbles that could potentially happen. And there is a lot of movement in the district. Again, I haven't been here long, but been here long enough to know that there's a lot of movement with families. And with that, I think we need to be really cautious about locking ourselves in. I think the policy as it stands works. I understand what the committee's been trying to do in trying to address one problem, but I'm very concerned about the problems that are going to arise from those changes. There are a couple other things in the policy, the language around out of district. To me, that's something that's really for Office of Student Services for students on with special needs.
No,
that's
not that district. It's out of their zone.
Right, and I'm wondering
Not
if
out of
that's some
district,
language that we need to amend. So I mean, I was using it as an example. There's language that we could adjust. I just want us to be really cautious that, again, more than anything, that as we try to attempt to fix one issue, that we don't create a domino effect going forward that makes it really difficult to implement and be fluid and flexible.
So I'm perfectly fine with putting the language back in about right to a neighborhood school, but that's actually less flexible. But if that's something that's an important value to everyone, and I can understand that, I think that's fine. But the part that still remains a bit more contentious for me is this notion that a student who has established a community at a certain school can be removed from that school because kids are resilient and will eventually get over it. Yes, that's true, but why put them through that stress in the first place if it's not necessary? And unfortunately, the policy has been utilized and has been implemented in such a manner to have students removed from schools, even when they're only 2 blocks away from where they were. And frankly, that doesn't seem appropriate to me. And if we're only talking about a handful of families that would be impacted by making this change, I think we should go ahead and make the change. And if we see this sea change of 30 people in a classroom at the K-8 level, we can certainly always modify it again. In terms of the kindergarten concern, I think a way to address that would be to simply add to the sentence about shall be granted permission to remain at the same school to include of attendance during the prior year. Kindergartens were not in attendance the prior year, so that would still allow some shifts there. If some of you feel that maybe there could be a middle ground where it's a certain number of years in a school community, that then they have the automatic right to remain at the school. Because I do see the arguments that if a student's only at, say, Lawrence for kindergarten, and let's say they're there the full year, do they really get to be at Lawrence for grades 1 through 8 if they then move to Baker? So I can see that argument.
Yeah,
But
I would put forth, David, I would support a middle school carve out for that. I do think that those grades and are different, and that it supports our philosophy on the K-8 model.
my one concern about a middle school carve out, though, is what do we do about siblings? So let's say that there's someone who's in 6th grade who wants to be able to remain for 7th and 8th, and they have a younger sibling who's in 2nd grade, and that 2nd grader relies on the 6th grader for after school care. If we now have them separated, that can be a problem. So that's why I think it's probably cleaner to not necessarily have a qualification around which grade.
I have significant concerns about qualifying grades. I think it's a slippery slope. But Valerie, I want you to understand, to know that I hear you. It can be incredibly challenging. I don't want anyone to think on the call that I'm being dismissive, because developmentally, I believe, philosophically, I believe the students are able to make the shift. We know that any change can be difficult. As a former MECO director, I took students into my program in 11th grade because I felt that at 11th grade, even though you hadn't been in the MECO program from kindergarten, you could be successful. I just think we just need to be really thoughtful that we're going. I can anticipate us coming back and doing this repeatedly if we're not careful. And what that messaging will send also to the community. And in regard, David, I hear you also talk about the implementing the practice. Those are things that we in Central need to firm up. So we have to redirect ourselves as we are going forward and we are implementing practice. It's really important that, you know, we kind of get our house in order to make sure there's some consistencies. And when we are being flexible, that is rooted in and grounded in equitable practices.
To that point, though, it's precisely because of conversations I've had with others at central office that we have this on the agenda for today, because I was being told that due to the policy, this was happening. And so if we don't want this to happen anymore, of families moving a few blocks and being removed from their community school, that we actually need to make the policy less flexible in the respects that we're addressing.
Megan, I'm wondering if you would like to go through the document, if we have that, if we can allow for that time to just kind of unpack some of your reasoning for some of the comments that you made in the notes, if folks are have appetite for that.
That's fine.
Okay. So one thing that in the original policy that I do think is interesting is that the policy starts, in fact, with the exceptions rather than the rule. It is structured in such a way as we're talking about all the ways you can get around the typical admission. I mean, it's the assignment policy, but there's no actual baseline of how the assignments are expected to be done, which is that neighborhood school, community school expectation. So that is the first thing I just wanted to point out, that is an interesting choice in historical documentation that's missing. There's no actual, like, this is how schools are generally assigned. So we are really de-emphasizing the neighborhood school in these edits. And then based on the changes, that's subject to certain provisions set forth below. These provisions that we use, which is the class sizes at the schools, both the one they're in and the one that they have moved towards, overall crowding, and, you know, staff distribution of supports and things like that, parents' reason for requests, and then the educational well-being. Based on some of these edits, these conditions would only apply to newly enrolling students and really does not provide the district with the ability to react in the constantly fluid and fluctuating environment that does and can happen over time. And then the sibling component, it does get a little sticky, as folks have sort of touched on. I believe that the sibling piece does not belong in the subset. I believe it does belong in that overarching area in terms of structure of the document, because it's not necessarily only that child's well-being. We have to look at all 4 of those pieces for siblings as well, which could include the parent's request, which could include the class sizes for that student's grade. We've talked about the kindergarten piece that is a concern. You know, people being able to keep their assignment for how long. You know, if you move in 1st grade, if you move in 2nd grade, you're still talking about 7 or 8 years, which can be cumulative in a school, because not maybe just one student has asked to remain, but you could have, by the time you reach 6th grade, you could have 10 extra kids in a grade because they've all asked to remain. And we are obligated to allow that regardless of the conditions, which we cannot predict for the future. And the fact that the language has moved from the town may be, that they may be granted, to shall be, really is going to paint us into a corner. It removes any flexibility the district has when conditions require it, which has happened in the past. And Helen's been around certainly long enough to know that there have been these bubbles in certain schools where enrollment is very tight in certain grades and not in certain schools and not others. You know, we really do need that flexibility for the district to make determinations and limitations to what we can provide to all families, including those who may be deemed to the community. And then there's a little piece in there about transportation, and I'm not quite sure what the thinking was there, because it sort of contravenes your own transportation policy, which is in another section. Basically, I would say if a student is receiving transportation because they have been placed at a school for special education and as part of their IEP, or they are currently actively accessing services at a different school, such as an English language education program where the geography is, you know, they're beyond that 1.5 mile boundary, then of course they should continue to receive those transportation services while they're receiving those services. But otherwise that could become quite costly, also the way that that's written. And I also fully agree that the out of district placement, that terminology, I would really love to see change to out of zone placement requests, because we're really talking about zones here rather than districts. I know that like on the map there is a district, but that is not really how school assignments work in Brookline. It is actually really by the school zone, which that's where the buffer zone. Some folks fall into it and some are out of it, but everybody has a zoned school. So we're really talking about zones, not districts, which terminology is also confusing for folks outside of the community who think they can be in a different community. They could be in Boston, for instance, and well, it's out of district, and it is confusing. They conflate that with school choice. So that terminology would be most helpful to be updated. Let's see. Right, and the other school districts in the buffer zone section is also, you know, a bit. I see where you're coming from on trying to give us the flexibility. If the philosophy has shifted away from, you know, emphasizing the neighborhood school, then that language would make sense. But if the perspective is really these neighborhood K-8 schools is the intent of how our school communities are built, we can send them to other schools feels very, I spend a lot of time speaking with families who are new to the community. They are coming from places where schools are full and they get sent wherever they get sent. And they are moving to Brookline particularly and specifically because we do not do that, right? They have a neighborhood school, and that's what they're looking for. That's what they've come here for. Many families from other countries and other states will ask, well, can I go to the school? Is it full? No, it's okay. We will educate your child. So that language is something that would really impact a great deal of the work that we do in finding a welcoming place for families. Yeah, I think those are the key things that I wanted to share.
All right, thank you. Andy?
Thanks. Yeah, so could I try to say where I think I'm landing after listening to this conversation? And Megan and Claire, if you think that I'm this is based on some misconceptions or failure to understand what you've been saying, please let me know. So, I mean, I'd be inclined not to touch the buffer zone section. That does seem all right to me as it stands. As far as section 1 goes, I can certainly imagine a situation where that leads to unintended consequences that create a real problem for the district. But Megan, you did say that currently we have maybe 15 families a year who would be sort of accessing that section of the policy. And you said that even some of those are only moving within a zone anyway. So there's no controversy there about where they land. And so if the scale of the issue is really that small, I feel okay with going ahead and making the change, which is the clear intent of the committee and also the clear intent of, I believe, staff in the way they finally disposed of the immediate cases that came up this fall. And then, if down the road it creates a problem, we can always revisit. It just doesn't seem like with fewer than 15 families a year, it's going to lead to, overcrowded schools and an impossible situation on the ground. Now, so am I continuing to miss something here?
So the number of families who inquire about it, so the folks who are moving within town, we get many more inquiries than those who actually transact it. And they make decisions based upon the information that we're able to share with them. So if I move, what will happen? Well, we can share that the school that you're in, the class sizes are very large, and we would suggest that it is quite possible that you might be asked to change schools, and they decide accordingly. So there is a greater proportion of that is not included here, people who do not actually transact these changes. So it's quite a slippery slope to take any flexibility out of it, and we will be back, I suspect, in order to fix something. I mean, policies are meant to be, from what I understand, policies are meant to work, and provide a certain amount of flexibility, rather than lock things into immovable shapes, which the current policy does. And this change would be a sea shift, and it would certainly provide families who are adept at navigating and reading through rules and finding loopholes. They would find that on the front end and then proceed accordingly. And that is where the bigger concern is. So I can move in here and then I can move later anytime I want. That would and does happen.
Helen?
So I'm wondering, I mean, it's never good to make policy on one or two cases or something that's really, out in the public, so to speak. I'm wondering if it wouldn't be an idea to take a year and do the statistics, actually keep track of how many requests you get, how many, you can figure out what data to put in there, or maybe other people know what data they want, how many 7th grader or 6th graders want to move, how many new people come in that want to go to a different district, the requests and then the actual of what happens. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, if we look, I've heard this in the past, if we look at our district, there's probably 10% in every school that are out of district for various reasons, maybe even more. So maybe something on that too. I think that's within your possibility of getting those statistics, and then come back and from the statistics start to figure out what makes more sense. That's a suggestion. I'm not on the committee, so you do what you want, but it's just, I just don't want to make a policy on one case. It's just not a good way to make policy. And the issue of it's interesting. I hadn't even thought about it. Certainly I felt that the sixth grader should stay. That was my, as a parent and I understand that. However, then thinking about, well, there's the other, what if they came in fifth grade? Does that still count the same way? I mean, yes, you don't want kids transitioning a lot of times. That's the whole point of K-8 schools. You don't want them transitioning. So maybe something we want the least amount of transitions feasible for a family or something like that. I don't know, but I would still get the data first and then think about what we do with the policy. It sounds like for this year, you're sort of all set anyways with people are in place for the most part. That's my suggestion.
So unfortunately, Helen, there still are some other families in limbo that if we don't change the policy, they're going to be stuck or potentially stuck because of that.
I strongly disagree with that statement, David. There's no families in limbo. Every student is placed in their school. Nobody's been displaced. All of these issues have been resolved at this time. So there's nobody in flux. Any requests have been
I'm hearing very differently from other staff and from at least one family quite directly about that. But that aside, I do appreciate your concern about whether there would suddenly be a sea change of other families looking to keep their children at the same school if they see a policy change. Perhaps a way around that would be to add additional language suggesting that there may be future modifications if attendance reaches a certain level, that this could be revisited to try to discourage that this is not necessarily a policy a provision that would be set in stone forever, that it could be again adjusted. I do think this is an important enough discussion that we want the full school committee to participate on this. So even if there's still some points of debate, and there certainly are, I would like to recommend referral to the full school committee for discussion purposes. At school committee, of course, there would be a first reading, there would be a second reading, there could even be a third reading, there could be certain additional modifications. I do agree with, I think, everyone here that the out of district terminology is outdated. I would just add that was in there before, so that's not a change from this draft, but that language should be changed to out of zone to not confuse with special education out of district placements. So I think we have agreement there. Then the kindergarten exception, I think there's probably agreement there that if at minimum we had language about attendance in the prior year, that would still allow flexibility around changing kindergarten placements. Andy?
And David, are you suggesting that we refer this to the full committee for discussion, but without a recommendation necessarily on how to proceed?
Right. And they would have a draft subject to these additional modifications I just explained that we could then discuss, and then school committee will do what it pleases with that. And I think that for part of the discussion, it would be helpful if we could know with a little more precision about what the numbers have looked like, including in terms of inquiries. But what happens if I move? Are those numbers kept track of? No? Okay.
At this time, no, we do not track our correspondence and inquiries by email and telephone. We get many. They come through my office. They come through the superintendent's office. Sometimes they come through our offices. So no, at this time, we do not have data on that. If that is something that you wanted to do, we would need time to address the request for information to provide to the committee in advance. We'll take a little bit of time to prepare that information regardless.
David, I
Valerie?
actually had a second part of my question, if I could ask it.
Sure.
If we are going to move this to the school committee, I think maybe we need some parallelism in how we treat siblings in the 3 sections. So currently the 2nd and 3rd sections do discuss what we do with siblings in that case, but the first one doesn't. So one way or the other, we should specify, does it create a presumption that any sibling can stay as well, or does it not? I would think not, but we should spell that out before sending this to committee.
All right, Valerie?
I had a question for Megan. Did we have anybody who requested a school in a buffer zone who did not get their first choice?
Many. In terms of buffer zone preferences, families are asked to state their preference. When they're new to the district, they're asked to state their preference. We say yes to as many as we can. However, in order to create balanced classes, we do say no to some people. Yeah. So not everybody gets the first preference. And I will say, many of those who do not get their first preference end up very pleased with the community that they join in the end, even if it was not their initial first preference. And sometimes families are new to the community, they just don't know. So if we're looking at a binary, it's hard to read the actual level of importance to the family as to whether they get that. And do know that there is an appeal process that we use as well. So if you don't get your first preference, you may ask again if we can take a look and make a change. And if we can, again, sometimes we are able to change that on the second look, and sometimes even a third look. So there's many opportunities that we do provide families to ask for what they want, explain their needs, their wants, which are 2 different things sometimes, for consideration. And we really, I think I register probably 1,500 kids a year. And we look at this question for every single one of them and address it very carefully. So just know that the number of families who are unhappy, we can't expect every family to have an end result that suits their preferences in all cases. We can't please all people all the time, unfortunately.
No, I'm just sort of curious on the sort of magnitude of many. How many families would that be?
That don't get their first.
That don't get their buffer zone preference.
That's a difficult question to answer off the top of my head, and I don't want to give you a number.
But do you have that data somewhere that you could?
I'm sure I could
Okay.
find it and extract it and analyze it for you,
Okay.
but it would take
Thank
some time.
Okay.
So we do have a hard stop at 9, and Helen, I will go to you. I just want to make sure that we address our last agenda item as well. But if we have a little bit of time before 9, we'll go back to this. But I'm hoping that, well, I would like to move that we refer this draft to the full school committee so that we can discuss this at the full school committee, subject to the following additional changes from the draft. The language from out of district will be changed to out of zone. There will be an addition of attendance during the prior year to the language about shall remain at the same school so that kindergarten placements are exempted. In addition to that, to Andy's point, there will be no presumption for siblings in the first section. Anything else? And again, this is not a recommendation of favorable action by the school committee, just that the school committee take this up.
Sure, I'll second that the school committee discuss it.
All right, Andy, your vote?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. Now, Helen, I will get to you, but I just want to make sure we get the warrant articles agenda item done, and this should only take a moment. So on the warrant articles agenda item, this is where we recommend to the full committee to take up possible position statements on warrant articles. There are only 18 warrant articles for this fall, so much fewer than the norm. And of those 18, having reviewed them, I only see 2 of relevance to the schools. One of them very clearly relevant, which is the Heath name change. So I think we'll likely agree that we'll have a statement on that. The second one, which I think maybe the school committee would want to consider, is warrant article 10. So warrant Article 10 is essentially saying that where there remains some funding from a loan, that funding can be used for any purpose that the town then decides. And it provides a specific example of the Ridley School project, that there was money left over from the Ridley project. If this warrant article were to pass, that remaining money from Ridley or from any other school project could be spent in any other manner. Now, there are probably a lot of other details to that warrant article that I don't yet understand because this is reading the summaries. But I think that we might take an interest in potentially having money that had been dedicated to schools being used for another purpose. And so I think we probably want a presentation on that when we have the warrant articles hearing. So my recommendation would be that we refer Articles 10 and also the Heath warrant article. I'm blanking on which number that is, that we refer those two to full committee.
Second.
All right, Andy, your vote?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right, so Helen, now we go back to you on the school assignment policy.
Yeah, I worry about taking up a huge amount of time of the school committee when we have a lot of other business on something that isn't, I mean, we don't have the data. We, right now, the policy, yes, it may not work for one or two families, but you don't make policy for one or two families, you make it for the district. So unless we can see from the data that there's a need to change it, spending time at school, I mean, we can bring it up and discuss it, but I think that this is premature and it's not a good way of the school committee doing business. That's why we have the subcommittees, to really flush out the things so that we can feel comfortable with putting something forward. My opinion, it's your committee and you guys do what you want. I'll probably say the same thing at full committee.
I would generally agree with you, Helen, but there is some time pressure on this one. And in my conversations with staff, there was a suggestion that we try to get this changed as quickly as we can. And generally, we have 2 readings at full school committee before making any change. Now, obviously, what those changes will be are still in flux, and maybe there'll be none, but there was some urgency in taking this up. Andy?
No, I'd actually lowered my hand.
Okay. Claire?
I'm just, Debbie, you've mentioned staff several times. I'm curious, what staff members are communicating a real issue without, confidentiality. I know is huge, but is there something that we could be doing on our end to be working with staff? That's part of our responsibility.
So I'm happy to talk to you about that after the meeting. All right, anyone else? Okay, is there any new business? All right, seeing none, that concludes our meetings. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.